The divine birth of a nation. Imagine standing at the edge of primordial chaos, where nothing exists but endless void and formless potential. Now watch as divine beings descend from heaven, armed with a jeweled spear that drips with the essence of creation itself. With each drop that falls into the churning sea below, islands emerge from nothingness, mountains rise from the depths, and an entire civilization's destiny takes shape. This is how Japan was born, not through geological processes or human migration, but through the deliberate actions of gods whose love, conflict, and tragedy would shape the spiritual DNA of one of the world's most fascinating cultures. The stories I'm about to tell you come from two of the most important texts in Japanese history, the Kojiki, or Record of Ancient Matters, completed in 712 CE, and the Nihon Shoki, or Chronicles of Japan, finished just 8 years later in 720 CE. These aren't just collections of myths. They're the foundation stones of Japanese identity. Texts that have influenced everything from Shinto religious practices to modern anime, from imperial succession to the way millions of people understand their relationship with nature and the divine. But here's what makes these texts absolutely revolutionary. They don't just tell us how Japan was created. They tell us that Japan was created deliberately, purposefully, as a sacred land chosen by the gods themselves. Every mountain, every river, every island has divine significance. This isn't just mythology. It's a worldview that sees the sacred in every aspect of the natural world and positions Japan as the central stage for interactions between heaven and earth. Whether you're watching from Tokyo or Toronto, Seoul or São Paulo, these stories speak to universal human questions. Where do we come from? What is our purpose? How do we relate to the divine? But they answer these questions in uniquely Japanese ways that have shaped one of the world's most distinctive cultures. As we explore these myths, think about the creation stories from your own culture. How do they shape the way you see the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're about to journey to the beginning of everything, when the universe was young, and the boundaries between gods and humans hadn't yet been fixed. We'll witness divine marriages that establish the patterns for human relationships, conflicts between siblings that mirror our own family dramas, but play out on a cosmic scale, and the establishment of a divine lineage that continues to this day in the world's oldest continuous monarchy. Before the beginning. The primordial chaos in the beginning, there was neither heaven nor earth, neither time nor space, neither light nor darkness in any form we would recognize. The universe existed as an infinite, formless mass that the ancient texts describe as being like an egg, containing all potential but lacking any actual manifestation. This primordial chaos churned for eons beyond counting, neither alive nor dead, neither something nor nothing, but rather the source from which all existence would eventually emerge. The Kojiki tells us that the first movement in this cosmic egg was a separation. The light, pure elements rose upward to form Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven, while the heavier, impure elements sank down to eventually become the earth. But between these realms stretched an infinite expanse of undefined space, a cosmic buffer zone where the rules of neither heaven nor earth fully applied. Into this primordial separation appeared the first gods, not born in any conventional sense, but simply manifesting as consciousness became possible. These first deities were so abstract, so removed from human understanding, that they barely had forms or personalities. The Kotoa Matsukami, the distinguished heavenly gods, included beings like Amenomi Nakanushi, the heavenly center lord, who represented the axis around which all creation would revolve. These primordial deities were followed by 7 generations of divine pairs, each slightly more defined and tangible than the last, as if creation itself was slowly learning how. to create beings with distinct identities and purposes. With each generation, the gods became more like the humans who would eventually worship them. They gained personalities, desires, conflicts, and the capacity for both creation and destruction. The fascinating thing about this cosmogony is how different it is from creation myths that begin with a single, all-powerful creator deity. In the Japanese understanding, creation is a collaborative process, requiring multiple generations of gods working in sequence, each adding their own contribution to the emerging universe. It's almost evolutionary in its conception, complexity emerging gradually from simplicity through successive iterations. By the seventh generation of gods, we encounter the divine pair whose names would become central to Japanese mythology, Izanagi no Mikoto and Izanami no Mikoto, whose names literally mean he who invites and she who invites. These weren't abstract cosmic principles, but fully realized divine personalities, capable of love and loss, creation and mourning, whose relationship would establish the template for all human partnerships to come. The other gods, recognizing that creation had reached a crucial juncture, gave Izanagi and Izanami a sacred mission that would define not just their own divine careers, but the entire future of what would become Japan. They were commanded to descend from the high plane of heaven and give solid form to the drifting, jellyfish-like mass that would become the earth below. To accomplish this monumental task, the divine assembly gave them the Amano Hoko, the heavenly, jeweled spear, a weapon that was also a tool of creation, capable of bringing order from chaos and form from formlessness. This wasn't just any divine artifact, but a symbol of legitimate authority passed down from the primordial gods themselves, making Izanagi and Izanami not just creators, but divinely appointed architects of the physical world. The divine marriage and the birth of the islands, standing on the floating bridge of heaven, a rainbow bridge that connected the celestial realm to the chaos below. Izanagi and Izanami looked down at the formless expanse beneath them. The world to be was nothing but an endless ocean of primordial brine, thick and viscous, moving without purpose or pattern. Together they thrust the heavenly jeweled spear into this cosmic soup and stirred. The sound of their stirring echoed across dimensions, a grinding, churning noise that was the first deliberate sound ever made in the physical realm. When they lifted the spear, drops of brine fell from its tip, and as they struck the surface below, they congealed and hardened, forming the first solid land, Onogoro-shima, the self-forming island. This first island was tiny, barely more than a cosmic anchor point, but it was enough. Izanagi and Izanami descended to this newborn land and erected a heavenly pillar called Amenomi Hashira, a cosmic axis that would connect heaven and earth forever. Around this pillar they built their palace, and there they prepared to undertake the next phase of creation, the birth of the Japanese archipelago itself. But first came the establishment of marriage itself as a divine institution. Izanagi and Izanami invented the marriage ceremony, creating the ritual that would bind not just gods, but eventually humans in sacred union. They walked around the heavenly pillar in opposite directions, she from the left, he from the right, and when they met, they exchanged the first marriage vows ever spoken. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that reveals deep cultural assumptions about gender roles and cosmic order. When they first performed the ceremony, Izanami spoke first, exclaiming at Izanagi's handsome appearance. This seemed natural enough, but when their first union produced a deformed child, Hiruko, the leech child, whom they had to set adrift in a boat of reeds, they realized something had gone cosmically wrong. Returning to heaven for consultation, they learned that their ceremony had been flawed because the female had spoken first, disrupting the proper order of things. Modern readers might bristle at this obvious gender hierarchy, but within the mythological framework, it established the patterns that would govern social relationships for millennia. They repeated the ceremony with Izanagi speaking first, and, this time, their union was blessed with successful creation. What followed was one of the most productive partnerships in mythological history. Through their divine union, Izanagi and Izanami gave birth to the islands of Japan themselves. Not metaphorically, but literally, each island was a child of their marriage, born from Izanami's divine womb. First came Awaji, then Shikoku, then Oki, Kyushu, Iki, Tsushima, Sado, and finally Honshu, the largest and most important of Japan's islands. Think about the profound implications of this origin story. The very land of Japan isn't just sacred territory. It's the literal offspring of gods, making every mountain, valley, and plain a divine birthright. This understanding has shaped Japanese attitudes toward their land for over 1,000 years, creating a relationship with the natural world that sees divinity not as separate from nature, but as inherent within it. After creating the islands, the divine couple continued their creative work, giving birth to the gods of the sea, winds, mountains, rivers, and trees. Each natural phenomenon received its own deity, creating a pantheon that reflected the Japanese experience of living in a geologically active, typhoon-prone, earthquake-shaken archipelago where nature's power was impossible to ignore. The couple's fertility seemed limitless. They produced gods of food and agriculture, establishing the divine precedent for rice cultivation that would become central to Japanese civilization. They created gods of crafts and construction, legitimizing human technology as part of the divine plan. Every aspect of life that would matter to the Japanese people first emerged from this divine marriage. The tragedy of Izanami. Death enters the world. The divine couple's creative partnership seemed destined to continue forever, populating the cosmos with an endless succession of deities who would oversee every aspect of existence. But as often happens in mythology, it was at the moment of their greatest triumph that tragedy struck, introducing death into a world that had known only birth and creation. The catastrophe came with the birth of Kagutsuchi, the god of fire. Unlike their previous children, who had emerged from Izanami's womb as fully formed islands or elegant deities, Kagutsuchi was born as living flame, his divine fire so intense that it burned his mother even as she gave him life. Izanami's birth canal was seared by sacred flames, her divine body consumed by the very force of creation she was bringing into the world. As Izanami lay dying, the first death in all of creation, she continued to give birth, her final acts as productive as everything that had come before. From her vomit came gods of minerals and clay. From her feces emerged gods of earth and soil. From her urine flowed the water goddess Mizuhame. Even in death, Izanami was creating, establishing the principle that death itself could be generative, that endings could be beginnings, that loss could lead to transformation. Izanagi's grief was cosmic in scale. He had lost not just his wife, but his creative partner, the other half of the divine equation that had brought the world into being. His tears became the first rain, his wails the first thunder. In his rage and anguish, he drew his sword and beheaded his infant son Kagutsuchi, the fire god whose birth had caused such devastation. But even this act of violence was creative. From Kagutsuchi's blood sprang 8 new volcanoes, from his body 8 more mountain gods. The mythology was establishing a principle that would resonate throughout Japanese culture. Even destruction could be productive. Even violence could serve creative purposes. Even death could generate new life. Unable to accept the loss of his beloved, Izanagi decided to do what no living being was meant to do: descend to Yomi, the land of the dead, to retrieve Izanami and restore her to the world of the living. This journey to the underworld, paralleling similar myths from around the world like Orpheus and Eurydice or Inanna's descent, would establish the permanent boundary between life and death. The horror of Yomi, the land of darkness, Yomi, the Japanese underworld, was not a place of punishment or reward, but simply the destination of all who died, a shadowy realm where the dead continued a pale reflection of earthly existence. It was neither heaven nor hell, but something more unsettling, a place where the familiar became grotesque, where the known became unknowable, where love could transform into horror. When Izanagi arrived at the gates of Yomi, he found them already closed, the barrier between life and death already established by Izanami's passing. But love gave him courage to call out to his wife, and to his joy, she answered from beyond the gates. Her voice was the same, gentle and loving, but something in its tone carried a new darkness, a quality that suggested transformations too terrible to contemplate. "My beloved husband," Izanami called back. "Why have you come so late? I have already eaten the food of Yomi, and now I belong to this place. The stove of the underworld has fed me, and I cannot simply return to the land of the living." This concept, that eating the food of the dead binds one to the underworld, appears in mythologies worldwide, suggesting some deep human understanding about the irreversibility of death, the way it fundamentally transforms those it touches. But Izanagi wouldn't accept this separation. He pleaded with Izanami to return, to resume their creative work, to help him manage a cosmos that felt incomplete without her. Moved by his desperation, Izanami agreed to petition the gods of the underworld for permission to return. But she made one condition that would prove to be Izanagi's undoing. He must not look upon her, must not enter the halls of the dead to see what she had become. She would speak with the underworld deities and return to him, but he must wait in darkness and trust in her word. The waiting became unbearable. Time moves differently in the realm of the dead, and what might have been moments in Yomi felt like eons to the waiting god. Finally, unable to contain his impatience and longing, Izanagi broke his promise. He took his comb, a sacred object that held some of his divine essence, and lit one of its teeth as a torch, creating the first artificial light to pierce the darkness of the underworld. What he saw in that flickering light became the stuff of nightmares that would haunt Japanese mythology forever. Izanami was no longer the beautiful goddess he had married, but a rotting corpse. Her divine body crawling with maggots, her flesh falling from her bones, thunder gods nesting in her decomposing organs. She had become the very embodiment of death itself, transformed from creator to destroyer, from source of life to harbinger of ending. The horror on Izanagi's face was matched only by the rage on Izanami's. His broken promise, his inability to accept her transformation, his violation of the boundary between life and death, all of this transformed her love into fury. She shrieked at him with a voice that shook the foundations of the underworld. "You have shamed me. You have looked upon what should not be seen." The chase and the final separation. What followed was the first chase scene in Japanese mythology, a pursuit that would establish the eternal conflict between life and death. Izanami, in her fury, sent the shikomi, the hags of the underworld, after her fleeing husband. These weren't just servants, but manifestations of death's hunger, creatures that existed to drag the living into the realm of shadows. Izanagi fled through the winding passages of Yomi, the first being to ever run in fear, establishing flight as a fundamental response to mortal danger. As he ran, he used his divine powers to create obstacles for his pursuers. He threw down his headdress, which transformed into grapes that the shikome stopped to devour. He cast away his comb, which became bamboo shoots that further delayed the chase. But Izanami herself joined the pursuit, and against the goddess of death herself, such tricks were merely delays. She commanded the 8 thunder gods that had taken residence in her corpse to join the chase, along with the armies of the underworld. 1,500 warriors of Yomi, each one a nightmare given form. The chase reached its climax at the boundary, between worlds, at the slope that led from Yomi back to the land of the living. Here, Izanagi found a peach tree, the first fruit tree, and hurled 3 peaches at his pursuers. The peaches, containing the essence of life itself, drove back the forces of death, establishing fruit as a symbol of vitality and renewal that would persist throughout Japanese culture. Finally reaching the pass between worlds, Izanagi performed an act that would separate life and death forever. He pulled down a massive boulder, one that would require 1,000 men to move, and placed it in the pass, creating an impermeable barrier between Yomi and the living world. On one side stood Izanagi, panting and traumatized, but alive. On the other stood Izanami, her fury undiminished by the barrier between them. Their final exchange across the boulder became a curse that would define human existence. Izanami declared, "My beloved husband, if you do this, I will strangle 1,000 of your people every day." She was establishing death as a permanent feature of human existence, ensuring that the living would always eventually join her in the underworld. Izanagi responded with equal determination. "My beloved wife, if you do that, I will cause 1,500 to be born every day." This exchange established the fundamental balance of existence. Life would always triumph over death by a margin, ensuring the continuation of creation despite the inevitability of ending. The placement of the boulder, called the sealed rock of the pass, created the permanent separation between life and death that defines human existence. No longer could the dead return to trouble the living, but neither could the living venture into death's realm and return unchanged. The boundary was fixed, the cosmic order established, and the age of mortality had begun. The purification. Birth of the greatest god Izanagi emerged from Yomi polluted by death, contaminated by his contact with the underworld in ways that went beyond physical filth to touch his very divine essence. The concept of kegare, ritual, impurity, entered the world through his experience, establishing the need for purification that would become central to Shinto practice and Japanese culture more broadly. He fled to the island of Kyushu, to a river called Tachibana, where he would perform the first misogi, ritual purification through water. This wasn't just bathing, but a cosmic cleansing, a restoration of divine purity through immersion in flowing water that would wash away the contamination of death and restore the proper order of existence. As Izanagi removed his clothing and jewelry, each item he discarded became a god. His staff became the god of crossroads, his belt the god of roads, his clothes various deities of weaving and fabric. Even his contamination was creative, transforming pollution into divinity through the act of conscious rejection and cleansing. When he entered the water, the purification began in earnest. He washed in the upper reaches of the river, but the current was too swift. He tried the lower reaches, but the current was too slow. Finally, in the middle reaches, he found the perfect balance, establishing the principle of the middle way that would influence Japanese philosophy for millennia. As he washed each part of his body, more gods emerged. From the filth washed from his left eye came Amaterasu, the sun goddess, born from his tears of grief, but transformed through purification into the source of all light and life. From his right eye emerged Tsukuyomi, the moon god, reflection and counterpart to his solar sister. From his nose came Susanoo, the storm god, whose turbulent nature reflected the violence and chaos of Izanagi's flight from the underworld. Think about the profound symbolism here. The 3 most important deities in the Japanese pantheon weren't born from sexual union or created through deliberate crafting, but emerged from an act of cleansing, from the transformation of grief and contamination into divine power. The sun came from tears, suggesting that even our sorrows can become sources of illumination. The moon came from the parallel eye, establishing the complementary duality that governs day and night. The storm came from breath, from the very life, force that had been threatened by death. Izanagi immediately recognized these three children as special, different from all the gods who had come before. To Amaterasu he gave dominion over the high plane of heaven and presented her with his sacred necklace, establishing her as the chief deity of the Japanese pantheon. To Tsukuyomi he gave the night realm, creating the temporal divisions that would govern human activity. To Susanoo he gave the seas and storms, the chaotic forces that could both destroy and renew. But this division of cosmic responsibilities would not proceed smoothly. The three siblings, born from trauma and purification rather than love and union, carried within them the conflicts and tensions that had produced them. Their relationships would be marked by rivalry, violence, and reconciliation that would establish the patterns for all divine and human relationships to follow. The celestial siblings, conflict in heaven. The relationship between Amaterasu and Susanoo became the defining divine drama of Japanese mythology, a cosmic sibling rivalry that would threaten the very fabric of creation. Where Amaterasu was responsible, dutiful, and committed to maintaining cosmic order, Susanoo was wild, unpredictable, and prone to destructive tantrums that shook the foundations of heaven and earth. The conflict began with Susanoo's refusal to accept his divine responsibilities. Instead of ruling the seas as his father had commanded, he spent his time weeping and wailing, his cries so powerful they withered mountains and dried up rivers. When Izanagi demanded an explanation, Susanoo revealed that he wanted nothing more than to join his mother Izanami in the underworld, preferring death's kingdom to his appointed realm. This rejection of divine duty was more than personal rebellion. It was cosmic insurrection that threatened the carefully ordered universe the gods had created. Izanagi, furious at his son's defiance, banished him from heaven and earth alike, casting him out to wander between worlds until he could learn proper divine behavior. But before accepting his exile, Susanoo insisted on saying farewell to his sister Amaterasu in her heavenly realm. The sun goddess, knowing her brother's chaotic nature, prepared for his arrival as if for war. She bound up her hair in masculine style, strapped on armor made from sacred beads, took up her bow and arrows, and stood ready to defend her realm against whatever destruction Susanoo might bring. When Susanoo arrived at heaven's borders, the very foundations of the celestial realm shook with his approach. Mountains trembled, rivers reversed their flow, and the carefully ordered fields of heaven were thrown into chaos. But Susanoo protested that he came in peace, that he merely wanted to say goodbye to his sister before accepting his punishment. To prove his sincerity, Susanoo proposed a contest that would demonstrate his pure intentions through divine procreation. They would each take an object belonging to the other and produce children from it. If his children were female, it would prove his heart was pure and his intentions peaceful. This contest of divine generation produced 8 children total. Amaterasu took Susanoo's sword, broke it into 3 pieces, chewed them up, and from her breath produced 3 elegant goddesses. Susanoo took Amaterasu's sacred beads, crushed them between his teeth, and from his breath produced 5 gods, including Oshihomimi, who would become the ancestor of the imperial line. The interpretation of this contest's results became itself a source of conflict. Susanoo claimed victory, arguing that since the 5 male gods had come from his breath, regardless of the source material, he had proven his sincerity. Amaterasu disagreed, pointing out that the males had come from her possessions and were therefore her children. This dispute over cosmic paternity-maternity would establish precedents for inheritance and legitimacy that would echo through Japanese history. The cave of heaven, darkness, falls. Emboldened by what he considered his victory, Susanoo's behavior in heaven became increasingly destructive. his actions escalated from mischief to cosmic vandalism that threatened the very foundations of celestial order. He broke down the divisions between Amaterasu's rice fields, filled in her irrigation ditches, and defecated in her sacred halls, where the first fruits were celebrated. At first, Amaterasu tried to excuse her brother's behavior with divine patience that reflected her role as the supreme deity. When he destroyed the rice fields, she suggested he was drunk. When he ruined the irrigation, she claimed he meant well but didn't understand agriculture. Her attempts to maintain harmony despite provocation established her as a model of patience and forbearance. But Susanoo's final outrage exceeded all boundaries of divine tolerance. While Amaterasu sat in her sacred weaving hall, creating garments for the gods with her celestial maidens, Susanoo performed an act of violence so shocking it would reverberate through eternity. He took a piebald horse, a sacred animal, flayed it alive, and hurled it through the roof of the weaving hall. The violence of this act was multi-layered. The weaving hall represented civilization, culture, and the ordered creation of beauty. The horse represented divine transportation between realms. By violently combining them, Susanoo wasn't just destroying property, but violating the fundamental categories that gave the universe meaning. One of Amaterasu's weaving maidens, startled by the bloody horse crashing through the roof, accidentally impaled herself on her shuttle and died. The first death in heaven, bringing mortality to a realm that was supposed to be eternal. Some versions suggest it was Amaterasu herself who was wounded, adding personal injury to cosmic insult. Amaterasu's response to this ultimate violation would plunge the entire universe into crisis. Overwhelmed by grief, fury, and despair at her brother's actions, she fled to a cave called Amano-Iwato, the rock cave of heaven, and sealed herself inside with a massive boulder. The sun goddess had gone into hiding, and with her light went all life, warmth, and hope from both heaven and earth. The universe plunged into darkness, not just the absence of light, but a cosmic darkness that threatened the very existence of creation. Plants stopped growing, spirits of disorder emerged from shadows, and the carefully maintained boundaries between order and chaos began to dissolve. The world was returning to the primordial darkness that had existed before creation, all because one god's trauma had driven her into isolation. This moment in Japanese mythology speaks to universal human experiences of depression, withdrawal, and the impact one person's absence can have on an entire community. When someone vital withdraws their light from the world, everyone suffers. Every culture has stories about the sun disappearing, but few frame it so clearly as a response to violation and trauma. The Dance of Uzume. Laughter saves the world. The 8 million gods of heaven gathered in emergency assembly at the riverbed of heaven, desperately seeking a solution to the cosmic crisis. Without Amaterasu's light, creation itself was unraveling. They needed to convince the sun goddess to emerge from her cave, but how could they reach someone who had withdrawn from existence itself in response to unbearable violation? The wise god Omoikane, deity of thought and intelligence, devised a complex plan that would require all the gods working in concert. This wasn't a problem that could be solved through force or individual heroism, but required community action, creativity, and an understanding of psychology that went beyond simple persuasion. First, they gathered the long-crying birds, the roosters, whose dawn calls usually welcomed the sun. They placed them near the cave to crow continuously, hoping to trick Amaterasu into thinking she had overslept and missed the dawn. When this failed, they realized they needed more elaborate measures. The gods commissioned the creation of a sacred mirror, Yata no Kagami, forged from metals gathered from the heavenly mountains. This wasn't just any reflective surface, but a divine artifact capable of capturing and reflecting divine essence itself. They also created magnificent jewels, Yasakani no Magatama, curved beads of such beauty they could captivate even divine eyes. They hung these treasures on a sacred sakaki tree placed directly in front of the cave, creating an altar that combined natural and crafted beauty in perfect harmony. But still, Amaterasu remained hidden. The crisis required something more than beauty or trickery. It required transformation of despair into joy. Enter Ame no Uzumi, the goddess of mirth and revelry, whose solution was as unexpected as it was effective. She overturned a tub near the cave entrance, creating a makeshift stage, and began to dance. But this was no ordinary dance. It was a performance that would save the universe through the power of laughter and shock. As Uzume danced, she began to remove her clothing piece by piece until she was dancing naked on the overturned tub, her movements becoming increasingly wild and provocative. She exposed her breasts, lifted her skirts, and revealed her genitals to the assembled gods in a display that was simultaneously sacred and profane, ritualistic and spontaneous. The 8 million gods burst into laughter, not polite divine chuckles, but roaring, uncontrolled laughter that shook the pillars of heaven. The sound was so unexpected, so contrary to the grief and desperation that had defined the darkness, that it penetrated even the sealed cave where Amaterasu hid. Think about the profound wisdom in this solution. They didn't try to convince Amaterasu through argument or force her out through threats. They created something so surprising, so contrary to expectation, that curiosity overcame trauma. Sometimes healing doesn't come through direct confrontation of pain, but through the unexpected introduction of joy. The return of light inside her cave, Amaterasu heard the thunderous laughter and was bewildered. How could there be such joy when she, the source of all light, was hidden? How could the gods be celebrating when the universe was dying? Her confusion grew when she heard Uzumi declare that they had found a goddess superior to Amaterasu herself. Curiosity finally overcame isolation. Amaterasu cracked open the boulder just slightly, just enough to peer out and demand an explanation. How can you all be laughing and dancing when I am hidden and the world is in darkness? And who is this goddess you claim is greater than me? The moment she created that tiny opening, the god's plan went into action. The strong god Ame no Tajika, who had been hiding beside the cave entrance, grabbed the boulder and pulled it completely away, making it impossible for Amaterasu to seal herself back inside. But it was what happened next that truly brought the sun goddess back to the world. Uzumi held up the sacred mirror, and for the first time, Amaterasu saw her own reflection. She had never seen herself before. There had been no mirrors in heaven, and she was transfixed by the radiant being she saw in the polished metal. This was the superior goddess they had been celebrating. Her own reflection, her own light, the beauty and power she had forgotten she possessed. As she leaned forward to get a better look at this magnificent being, fascinated by her own divine radiance, the gods quickly stretched a sacred rope, Shimenawa, across the cave entrance, creating a barrier that would prevent her from retreating back into darkness. The universe was saved not through force, but through Amaterasu's recognition of her own worth and beauty. The return of light to the universe was gradual, like dawn after the longest night. Plants began to grow again, the spirits of disorder retreated to their proper places, and the cosmic order that Amaterasu's presence maintained was restored. But things could never go back to exactly how they were before. The universe had learned that even gods could be wounded, that light could be lost, and that community action was sometimes necessary to heal individual trauma. Susanoo's punishment for causing this cosmic crisis was severe. The gods cut off his beard and fingernails, symbols of his divine status, and banished him from heaven permanently. But in a final act of reconciliation, Susanoo presented his sister with a sword he would later win from the Yamata no Orochi, Kusanagi, the grass-cutting sword that would become one of the three sacred treasures of Japan, Susanoo's redemption. The eight-headed serpent banished from heaven and wandering the earth, Susanoo underwent a transformation that would change him from cosmic villain to cultural hero. His journey to redemption began when he descended to the land of Izumo, where he encountered an elderly couple and their daughter crying by a river. Their grief so profound it moved even the chaotic storm god to compassion. The family explained their sorrow. They had once had 8 daughters, but 7 had been devoured by the Yamata no Orochi, a monstrous serpent with 8 heads and 8 tails, whose body stretched across 8 valleys and 8 hills, with trees and moss growing on its back like a moving mountain range. Now the monster was coming for their last daughter, Kushinada Hime, and they had no power to stop it. This was Susanoo's moment of choice. He could have continued his wandering, avoided involvement, and left mortals to their fate. Instead, he saw an opportunity for redemption, a chance to use his chaotic powers for protection rather than destruction. He offered to save Kushinada Hime, but only if her parents would give her to him as his wife. The transformation of Kushinada Hime into a comb that Susanoo placed in his hair was more than a hiding strategy. It was a mystical marriage that bound their fates together. She would be with him in the battle, not as a passive prize, but as an active participant whose presence would guide his actions. Susanoo's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He had the elderly couple brew the strongest sake possible, 8 vats of it, 1 for each of the serpent's heads. When the Yamata no Orochi arrived, it found not a cowering maiden, but an irresistible feast of alcohol. Each head drank deeply from its own vat, and soon the monster was thoroughly intoxicated, its 8 heads swaying drunkenly before it collapsed in stupor. The battle that followed wasn't a battle at all, but an execution. Susanoo methodically cut off each head and each tail, his sword singing through serpentine flesh with the precision he had once used for destruction, now turned to salvation. But when he reached the 4th tail, his sword struck something hard and shattered. Inside the serpent's body, he discovered a magnificent sword, Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, a blade so perfect it could only have been forged by divine hands. This sword would become one of the 3 sacred treasures of Japan, but Susanoo, in an act that showed his genuine transformation, didn't keep it for himself. He presented it to Amaterasu as a peace offering, a symbol of his repentance for the chaos he had caused in heaven. The storm god, who had once thrown a flayed horse into his sister's weaving hall, now offered her the most precious treasure he had ever found. The marriage of Susanoo and Kushinada Hime established the storm god as a protector of humanity rather than its tormentor. Together they had children who would become the ancestors of various Japanese clans, and Susanoo's descendants would include Okuninushi, who would become one of the most important gods in the Japanese pantheon, particularly in the Izumo region, the divine genealogy, from gods to emperors. The transition from the age of gods to the age of humans didn't happen suddenly, but through a gradual genealogical progression that linked heaven and earth through blood and marriage. Amaterasu's grandson, Ninigi no Mikoto, would become the bridge between the celestial and terrestrial realms, sent from heaven to establish divine rule on earth. The story of Ninigi's descent, the Tensen Korin, is perhaps the most politically significant myth in Japanese history, as it establishes the divine right of the imperial family to rule Japan. When Amaterasu decided that the earthly realm needed direct divine governance, she first sent her son Ame no Oshihomimi, but he looked down at the chaos and disorder of the earth and returned to heaven, claiming the land was too turbulent for divine rule. Several other gods were sent as advanced scouts to pacify the earth, but they either failed in their missions or, seduced by earthly pleasures, chose to stay and never reported back. The earth seemed unconquerable, too wild for heaven's order to tame. But Amaterasu was determined that her bloodline would rule the land that her parents had created. Finally, she chose her grandson Ninigi for the mission, equipping him with the 3 sacred treasures that would become the regalia of Japanese emperors. The mirror, Yata no Kagami, that had drawn her from the cave, the jewels, Yasakani no Magatama, that had decorated the tree outside her hiding place, and the sword, Kusanagi, that Susanoo had won from the serpent. These 3 treasures weren't just symbols of power but actual vessels of divine authority. The mirror represented wisdom and honesty, the ability to see truth, including the sometimes harsh truth about oneself. The jewels represented benevolence and compassion, the beauty that makes life worth living. The sword represented valor and decisiveness, the willingness to cut through obstacles and protect the innocent. When Ninigi descended to Earth, he didn't come alone. He was accompanied by 5 clan chiefs who would become the ancestors of Japan's most important noble families, establishing not just imperial divinity, but an entire aristocratic system with heavenly origins. The very structure of Japanese society was being written into the mythology as divinely ordained. Ninigi's landing place was Mount Takachiho in Kyushu, far from where the imperial capitals would eventually be established. But this geographical detail is significant. It suggests that divine authority had to prove itself in the periphery before claiming the center, that legitimacy came not from immediate dominance, but from gradual expansion and consolidation. The mortality curse. Why Humans Die Own of the most poignant episodes in the transition from divine to human involves Ninigi's marriage choice, a decision that would curse humanity with mortality. When Ninigi descended to Earth, he met Konohana Sakuya Hime, the goddess of cherry blossoms, whose beauty was as ephemeral as the flowers she represented. He fell instantly in love and asked her father, the mountain god Oyamatsumi, for her hand in marriage. The mountain god was delighted to have his daughter marry Amaterasu's grandson, but he had 2 daughters, not one, along with the beautiful Konohana Sakuya Hime. He offered Iwanaga Hime, the goddess of rocks, whose appearance was less pleasing but whose nature was eternal and enduring. The mountain god understood that both sisters together would create a perfect balance, beauty and permanence, delight and stability. But Ninigi, seeing Iwanaga Haime's unattractive appearance, rejected her and married only Konohana Sakuya Hime. The mountain god was deeply offended and revealed the consequence of this choice. Had Ninigi married both sisters, his descendants would have been both beautiful and immortal, combining the cherry blossom's beauty with the rock's permanence. By choosing only beauty, Ninigi condemned his lineage, including all future emperors and ultimately all humanity, to lives that would be beautiful but brief, flowering brilliantly like cherry blossoms but inevitably falling. This myth does something remarkable. It doesn't present mortality as punishment for sin or disobedience, but as the consequence of an aesthetic choice, a preference for beauty over durability. The Japanese acceptance of life's transience, the aesthetic of mono no aware, the pathos of things, finds its mythological origin in this divine marriage. When Konohana Sakuya Hime became pregnant after just one night with Ninigi, he doubted her fidelity. How could she conceive so quickly? This doubt, the first jealousy between divine spouses since Izanagi and Izanami, required a dramatic resolution. Konohana Sakuya Hime declared that if the children were truly Ninigi's, they would survive. Any trial, she built a doorless hall, set it on fire, and gave birth in the flames. 3 sons were born in that burning hall, and all survived, proving their divine paternity. These fire-born princes would become the ancestors of the Yamato line, and one of them, Hori, would continue the genealogy that led to the first human emperor. The trial by fire became more than a proof of legitimacy. It established the principle that true divinity could survive any test, that legitimate authority proved itself through ordeal. The Dragon Palace under the sea Hori's story provides another crucial link between the divine and human worlds, this time through the realm that exists between heaven and earth, the ocean and its Dragon Palace. Hori had lost his brother's fishhook. While trying to use it for fishing, and despite making 500 hooks as replacement, his brother Hoderi demanded the return of the original. Desperate, Hori traveled to the palace of Watatsumi, the dragon god of the sea. This underwater realm was neither heaven nor earth, but something in between. A place where different rules applied and where transformations were possible that couldn't happen in either the celestial or terrestrial realms. The Dragon Palace was a place of wonder that surpassed even heavenly splendors. Its gates were coral, its walls were pearl. Its rooms changed with the seasons, though it existed outside time. Fish swam through the air as if it were water, and water formed solid structures, as if it were stone. It was a realm of perpetual possibility, where the boundaries that defined reality elsewhere were fluid and negotiable. Hori married Toyotama Hime, the dragon god's daughter, and lived in the palace for 3 years that passed like 3 days. When he finally remembered his purpose and recovered the lost fishhook, which had been found in a fish's throat, his father-in-law gave him additional gifts, 2 jewels that could control the tides, raising and lowering the waters at will. With these gifts, Hori returned to the surface world and used the tide-controlling jewels to subdue his brother, establishing his supremacy and the principle that divine favor mattered more than birthright. But the real significance of this story came when Toyotama Hime followed him to the surface to give birth to their child. Like her ancestor Izanami, Toyotama Hime made her husband promise not to watch her give birth. And like Izanagi, Hori broke his promise, discovering that his wife transformed into a giant shark or crocodile while delivering their child. The pattern repeated: the violation of feminine mystery, the revelation of primal truth, the permanent separation that followed. Toyotama Hime returned to the sea, leaving her son Ugaya Fukiyaizu to be raised on land. But she sent her younger sister, Tamayori Hime, to nurse the child, and eventually Ugaya Fukiyaizu married his aunt, continuing the divine bloodline through another generation of complex relationships between realms. Jimmu, the first emperor Ugaya Fukiyaizu and Tamayori Hime, had 4 sons, the youngest of whom would become Jimmu, the first human emperor of Japan. With Jimmu, we reach the bridge between mythology and history, the point where divine genealogy transforms into imperial chronology. According to the traditional dating, Jimmu ascended to the throne on February 11th, 660 BCE, a date still celebrated as National Foundation Day in Japan. Jimmu's story is one of conquest and consolidation, but it's also about the transformation of divine authority into political power. Born in Kyushu, where his great-grandfather Ninigi had descended from heaven, Jimmu looked eastward and declared that the center of the realm lay in Yamato, the region that would become modern-day Nara and the heartland of Japanese civilization. The Eastern expedition of Jimmu wasn't just a military campaign, but a cosmological journey from the periphery to the center, from the place of divine descent to the place of human rule. Along the way, Jimmu and his brothers faced both human enemies and supernatural challenges, requiring them to use both the divine treasures of their inheritance and practical military strategy. One of the most significant episodes occurred when Jimmu's forces were trapped and facing defeat. A golden kite, a divine bird, landed on Jimmu's bow, its radiance so brilliant that it blinded his enemies and allowed his forces to escape. This divine intervention proved that heaven still watched over Amaterasu's descendants, but it was the last direct supernatural aid the imperial line would receive. From this point forward, emperors would have to rule through human means while carrying divine blood. The Nihon Shoki and Kojiki diverge in many details of Jimmu's conquest, but both agree on the fundamental point. He established his capital in Ei, Yamato and founded a dynasty that would rule Japan continuously for over 2 millennia. The mythology had accomplished its purpose. It had created an unbroken chain from the primordial gods to the historical emperors, legitimizing imperial rule as not just politically expedient but cosmologically necessary. The meaning of the myths. Eternal truths. What makes the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki so much more than ancient stories is how they've shaped Japanese consciousness for over 1,300 years. These myths don't just explain where Japan came from. They define what Japan is. A sacred land created by gods, ruled by their descendants, where every mountain, river, and tree potentially houses divine presence. The concept of kami, often translated as gods, but really meaning something more, like sacred spirits, permeates these texts and Japanese culture. There are 8 million kami, a number that means infinite, suggesting that divinity isn't concentrated in a single supreme being, but distributed throughout creation. This diffuse sacred presence means that any place, object, or even concept can become a vessel for divine power. The myths establish patterns that resonate throughout Japanese history and culture. The emphasis on purification after contamination becomes the Shinto practice of misogi and the cultural emphasis on cleanliness. The tragedy of Izanagi and Izanami's separation establishes death as natural but not final. The dead continue to exist in yomi, influential but separate. The conflict and reconciliation between Amaterasu and Susanoo provides a template for managing social conflict through withdrawal, mediation, and eventual reintegration. The aesthetic principles embedded in these myths have profoundly influenced Japanese art and philosophy. The choice of cherry blossom beauty over rock permanence didn't just explain mortality. It established an aesthetic that finds profound beauty in transience, that sees the fleeting nature of life not as tragedy, but as what makes each moment precious. This aesthetic would develop into concepts like mono no aware, wabi-sabi, and other, uniquely Japanese ways of finding beauty in impermanence and imperfection. The political implications of these myths cannot be overstated. Until 1945, the Japanese emperor was officially considered a living god, a direct descendant of Amaterasu. The sun goddess on the Japanese flag isn't just a national symbol, but a reminder of this divine connection. Even today, when the emperor's role is purely ceremonial, the imperial family's legitimacy derives from this mythological genealogy. Think about how radically different this is from Western concepts of political legitimacy, which tend to derive from social contracts, divine, appointment that can be revoked, or popular sovereignty. In the Japanese mythological framework, the emperor's right to rule comes from blood, from being literally descended from the gods who created the islands of Japan. This isn't a metaphor or symbolic truth, but was understood as historical fact for most of Japanese history. Shinto. Living mythology. The mythologies of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki aren't preserved just in texts, but lived out daily through Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion. Every Shinto shrine is a physical manifestation of these mythological truths, a place where the boundary between the human and divine worlds becomes permeable. The most sacred Shinto shrine, Ise Grand Shrine, houses Amaterasu herself, or rather, it houses the sacred mirror that represents her presence on Earth. This isn't considered a symbol of the sun goddess, but her actual presence, making the shrine a direct link to the mythological events we've explored. Every 20 years, the shrine is completely rebuilt, combining permanence of tradition with acceptance of material impermanence. The three sacred treasures, the mirror, jewels, and sword, still exist, at least officially, and play a role in imperial succession ceremonies. When a new emperor ascends the throne, he receives these treasures in a ceremony that reenacts Ninigi's descent from heaven, maintaining the mythological connection across centuries of historical change. Shinto rituals recreate mythological events in annual festivals. The Niname-sai, the harvest festival, reenacts Amaterasu's celebration of the first rice harvest in heaven. Local festivals often dramatize the conflict between order and chaos, with portable shrines, mikoshi, being violently shaken to represent Susanoo's chaotic energy before being brought to rest in temporary harmony. The concept of kagare, pollution, and the need for purification that originated with Izanagi's contamination by death continues to structure Japanese religious and social life. Before entering a shrine, worshippers wash their hands and mouths at a purification fountain. Major life events, birth, death, menstruation, create states of impurity that require purification before participating in religious activities. Even secular Japanese culture carries these mythological patterns. The practice of bowing apologetically, the emphasis on group harmony, the aesthetic appreciation of nature, all have roots in the mythological worldview established by the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. The myths don't just explain the past, they continue to shape the present. Modern echoes, from mythology to pop culture. The influence of these ancient myths extends far beyond traditional religion into every aspect of modern Japanese culture, including the pop culture that has spread Japanese mythology worldwide. Anime, manga, and video games consistently draw on these mythological sources, reinterpreting ancient gods for contemporary audiences. Studio Ghibli's films are suffused with Shinto sensibilities derived from these myths. The bathhouse in Spirited Away, where gods come to cleanse themselves, directly references the purification themes from Izanagi's cleansing. The forest spirits in Princess Mononoke embody the kami concept that every natural feature has its own divine spirit. These aren't just fantasy elements, but contemporary expressions of mythological truths. Video games like Okami explicitly retell the Amaterasu myth, with players controlling the sun goddess in wolf form as she restores light to a world plunged into darkness. The Legend of Zelda series, while not explicitly Japanese in setting, draws heavily on the mythological structure of divine treasures, world-threatening chaos, and heroes who bridge the human and divine realms. The concept of transformation, central to many anime and manga, has its roots in these myths. Toyotama Heim becoming a sea creature during childbirth, gods taking human form, objects becoming deities. This fluidity of form that characterizes Japanese popular culture stems directly from the mythological precedents in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. Even seemingly modern concepts like kawaii, cute, culture can be traced to these myths. The preference for Konohana Sakuya Jaime's delicate beauty over Iwanaga Jaime's solid permanence established an aesthetic that values the small, delicate, and ephemeral. The idea that power can be cute, that strength can coexist with vulnerability, appears in Amaterasu's curiosity about her own reflection and Uzume's playful dance saving the world. The psychological patterns established in these myths continue to resonate. The hikikomori phenomenon, social withdrawal and isolation, can be seen as a modern echo of Amaterasu's retreat into the cave. The solution in the myth, community effort, surprise, and gentle coaxing rather than force, provides a template for addressing contemporary social issues. The eternal relevance of ancient myths. We reach the end of our journey through the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. It's worth reflecting on why these ancient stories matter not just to Japan but to our global human heritage. These myths do what all great mythologies do. They take the fundamental questions of human existence and provide answers that are simultaneously specific to one culture and universal in their applicability. The creation story of Izanagi and Izanami tells us that the world exists because of relationship. That creation requires partnership between complementary forces. Their tragedy tells us that death is the price of creation, that loss is woven into the fabric of existence from the very beginning. These aren't just Japanese truths, but human truths expressed through Japanese imagery. Amaterasu's retreat into The cave and eventual return speaks to anyone who has experienced trauma, depression, or the desire to withdraw from a world that has hurt them. The community's response, using creativity, humor, and collective action rather than force, provides a model for healing that transcends cultural boundaries. We all know what it's like to lose our light. These myths show us one way it might: return. Susanoo's journey from destructive chaos to protective hero demonstrates that redemption is possible, that our worst qualities can be transformed into our greatest strengths. The storm god who destroyed his sister's weaving hall became the hero who saved a family from a monster. This transformation wasn't achieved through punishment, but through encountering genuine need and choosing to respond with compassion rather than selfishness. The genealogical progression from gods to humans suggests that we all carry divine potential within us, that the boundary between sacred and mundane is more porous than we might think. You don't have to believe in the literal truth of these genealogies to appreciate their psychological truth. We are all descendants of something greater than ourselves, carriers of possibilities that exceed our mundane existence. The aesthetic, choices embedded in these myths, the preference for cherry blossoms over rocks, for transient beauty over permanent ugliness, have given the world new ways to appreciate existence. The Japanese aesthetic sensibility, rooted in these mythological choices, has enriched global culture with its unique perspective on beauty, impermanence, and the value of the momentary. For Japan itself, these myths continue to provide a sense of identity and continuity that has survived massive historical changes: the introduction of Buddhism, the Meiji Restoration, defeat in World War II, rapid modernization. Through all these transformations, the mythological foundation has remained, adapted but never abandoned, providing a continuous thread of identity across centuries of change. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki is that mythology matters, that the stories we tell about our origins shape who we become. These texts remind us that humans are mythological animals. We don't just need food and shelter, but also need narratives that make sense of our existence, that connect us to something larger than ourselves, that transform the chaos of experience into the order of meaning. Whether you're Japanese or not, whether you practice Shinto or not, whether you believe these stories literally or see them as elaborate metaphors, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki offer profound insights into human nature, social organization, and our relationship with the natural world. They show us one culture's answer to universal questions, and in doing so, help us understand both the diversity and unity of human experience. As we face our own modern challenges, environmental destruction, social isolation, the search for meaning in an increasingly secular world, these ancient myths offer not solutions but perspectives. They remind us that humans have always faced chaos and have always found ways to create order. They show us that withdrawal sometimes precedes renewal, that community action can heal individual trauma, that the sacred exists not in some distant heaven, but in the world around us, waiting to be recognized and honored. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the divine origins of Japan. These stories have survived for over 1,300 years, not because they're historically accurate, but because they're spiritually true, because they speak to something fundamental in human nature that transcends time and culture. Like and subscribe if you want to explore more mythologies that have shaped our world, and remember, we are all living out myths, whether we know it or not. The question is, which myths are we choosing to embody? In your own life, in your own corner of the world, you're part of an ongoing story that connects the past to the future, the human to the divine, the individual to the community. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki remind us that these connections aren't just important, they're sacred. And that's a truth that transcends any single culture or religion, a truth as relevant today as it was when Izanagi and Izanami first stirred the primordial waters with their jeweled spear. The myths continue. The story isn't over, and you're part of it.